Hi, it's Jerry Roberts back with another community conversation. And today we are speaking with Aaron Jones, a graduate of UCSB in Black Studies and Political Science, who currently serves as the director of the Educational Opportunity Program at the university. Aaron, thanks for being on.
Good to see you, Jerry. Thanks for having me.
And I should note we're former colleagues out at the university, both laboring in the student affairs department there. So you recently co-led an unusual hearing before the Board of Supervisors on racial equity in the criminal justice system. And I want to start by just getting your overall perspective of this national moment that we're in about anti-racism and police brutality that was galvanized by the brutal killing by police of George Floyd. You described yourself in your introduction there as a structuralist. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was invited, just to contextualize it properly, by Director of First Five and School Board member Wendy Sims-Moten to join her in that conversation, which I was happy to accept. That's what precipitated my participation there. And in terms of my initial comments about being a structuralist, I found that in conversations over the past several months, even maybe a year, I find myself kind of, when asked the question, well, what do you think we should do? Or, what's your opinion about how to make this a better, more just, more equitable world? I keep finding myself going back to discussions about the structure. Like, if we are not looking at the very foundations upon which our society rests and was built, then we will always, in my humble opinion, fall short of being able to truly address and redress the challenges and the ills and the atrocities that have taken place. It's akin to what I mentioned during the Board of Supervisors meeting, that even advocates in social justice, individuals and collectives, whether or not they identify with Black Lives Matter or personally or culturally, recognize that until there is some recognition and acknowledgement and reconciliation with not just the original sin, which is this country, which is slavery, but the companion original sin, which is the genocide of the indigenous population of not just this country, but this entire hemisphere. That until we still acknowledge that and what that actually means, particularly for the ascendants of those individuals and those populations in these areas, that we're going to keep coming up to this. We're going to keep coming to this point. And for other communities, say, for example, the Asian and Asian American identified community that have throughout this pandemic been experiencing a lot of intolerance and hates and acts of xenophobia, for that community to say it's not even just about us, this is deeply rooted in these twin original sins, if you will, that had laid the foundation for other peoples, of difference, of different identities to be treated the ways in which people are treated. And that goes further and further on, if we want to look at it or explore it more closely, into other culturally identified communities, folks who identify in the LGBTQI plus community. I mean, you name it, all of the other communities. The foundation by which people are treated is really rooted in those twin atrocities. Hence the structuralism.
Right. So, maybe put another way, it's, we're really looking at two different versions of history, or at least two different versions of history. And you, in talking about police violence and so on, you mentioned law enforcement, the history of law enforcement going back to slave patrols. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that hard to find, and it's well researched that prior to the rampant institution of slavery in this country, which required people who identified as white to be able to be a part of the mechanism of controlling the African enslaved population, that there needed to be some sort of system in place to, particularly for poor whites, to be able to be have some semblance of power and authority over Black bodies. And so slave patrols were put into place in the North and in the South during the slavery period to be able to essentially, hunt down and catch and even kill runaway slaves. And they were given authority, essential authority by the state over Black bodies. And those are the antecedents of what we now call modern day law enforcement. Prior to that, there was no such thing as modern day law enforcement as it exists today. Some would even say the very word officer is derived from overseer. So that's what I was saying. Like, we need to kind of dig down into the history, which is readily available, as to how law enforcement, again, going back to the structure, getting back to the foundations, how law enforcement evolved in this country, why it evolved, and then how it's been utilized and used and, over the many, many decades since, to really kind of keep control of things. Now, it's safe to say, obviously, that there's a peacekeeping factor or element in law enforcement, right? That's often talked about. These are peace officers, which is well and good rhetorically. However, that's not how it started. So until we kind of get at that, that core foundation, that root, and understand it, then I think we're going to keep coming into this environment, in this situation where, just like during slavery, Black bodies are devalued and are annihilated.
And then you also added that subsequent to slavery being legally abolished, then we had the rise of Jim Crow, and you used a very powerful Martin Luther King quote. About, white people being fed Jim Crow and educated. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't remember precisely when I stumbled across it. It was a speech that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave at the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March, 1965, maybe. I may have that incorrect. And during this long speech, he kind of takes a quick segue to talk about how, at the conclusion of the of slavery, the official conclusion or end of slavery, that the white male dominant power structure had to create something to keep Black people in their place, right? And so an ideology was crafted based in white supremacy that said that, you may be white and poor, you may be impoverished, you may not have any land, you may not have any education, but at least you're not Black. And so this is the roots of Jim Crow. And so then, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King goes on very poetically to say, something along the lines of, and when, they didn't have anything to educate themselves with, they educated themselves with Jim Crow. When they didn't have any, anything to shelter themselves with, they sheltered themselves with Jim Crow. And then the last piece, which really stuck with me, he said something like, and even when their malnourished children cried out for sustenance and there was nothing to eat, they fed them Jim Crow. And so that really, the impact and the value of that is so significant, because it talks about a belief system that we are incorporated with, from the very, very beginning. And I say we, the collective we, and how that is perpetuated such that, we don't even have a full grasp and understanding of like how deeply rooted, going back to the structure, like how deeply rooted this psychology, arguably even this psychosis, is embedded in our very society. And it goes back to, the Jim Crow era, and even prior to the Jim Crow era. And as I even said in my comments, like you can take it back a couple thousand years if you really want to have that conversation in terms of male dominance in this world. But there's a lot of different rabbit holes down which we can go.
Yeah. And then, fast forward, and you said this is nothing new, referring again to the kinds of issues that we're seeing today. So, probably the first video recorded beating of a black man by the white police of Rodney King in the early 90s. And then subsequent to that, many more, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and so on, and I'm old enough to remember the Kerner Commission, when there was a commission, we're going to look into the roots of why there were riots in the cities in the 60s. And then the Christopher Commission followed the Rodney King. Is this time different though? It's, there's a lot of polling, basically 64% in this Kaiser Foundation poll, 64% people overall support the protests against police violence now, including 61% of white people. Do you think this time there's something different going on?
It certainly feels that way. I mean, it's kind of paradoxical. Like it feels very similar, particularly for those who are from communities or ethnic backgrounds who tend to be on the receiving end of a lot of this hostility, a lot of this violence and aggression. So in that respect, it's not anything new. I remember the Rodney King decision in '92, and the fervor, not just in LA, not just in California, not just around the nation, but literally demonstrations around the world. People took to the streets in recognition of the blatant injustice that decision represented. So there's similarity in that, but there's difference in that, as I understand it, and this could be researched, for the first time in the US history, there were demonstrations in all 50 states in response to the murder of George Floyd. And to my understanding, that has never happened before. We have, as others have observed, and I think even Dave Chappelle in his most recent Netflix piece, 846, rightfully observed as well. We have the youth standing up in ways, in a unified ways, representing the diversity and complexity of our various identities, who are really at the forefront of these movements. So I think that there are a lot of similarities, but there's definitely a different tenor. And I think this is represented by the expeditious ways in which many corporations and large multi-state, multinational entities are moving to kind of acquiesce to the movement in so many ways. The Mrs. Butterworths and the Uncle Ben's Rice, and even our own local Sambo's restaurant over on Cabrillo, or Goodall from the NFL saying we were wrong and Kaepernick should get a job back, to I saw a commercial on just last night on the NBA, and they were talking about, they had the hashtag Black Lives Matter. So that's pretty profound. And that definitely didn't happen to the degree in which it is happening now, like even with the Rodney King decision or any of these other atrocities against Black bodies. So there is a different tenor. But again, for me personally, going back to the structural nature, like you can change an icon, you can change a logo, you can change the name of a building, but what are the very foundations of the building? And, even for our local context in Santa Barbara, how much are we going to acknowledge, when are we going to acknowledge the fact that, the complete genocide of the Chumash people, was the precursor for the development of what is now our beloved community of Santa Barbara, the blood and the sweat and the bodies of the indigenous people who lived in our area for no short of 10,000 years prior to the arrival of the Spanish, which is unfathomable considering our country is not even 300 years old. So there's a deep-rooted legacy that we need to, I think, to acknowledge. Even within the Division of Student Affairs at UC Santa Barbara, under the leadership of our Vice Chancellor, Margaret Cologne, in all the beginning of all our meetings, some of our gatherings, we do a land acknowledgement, which is just to say, very simply, but very honorably and respectfully, we acknowledge the land upon which we stand. We acknowledge the elders and the energy that's here. And I think that we need to, kind of like in a manner of peace and reconciliation, as akin to what South Africa went through at the end of apartheid, just really just acknowledging the truth. Or truth and reconciliation, wasn't peace, but reconciliation. So, and I don't think that very many people are asking for anything more than just that. And just because one truth may be this is the greatest country in the world and we've been able to, achieve all these great things, that can exist simultaneously with It doesn't contradict, but it can exist simultaneously with, and this country was founded on genocide of Native Americans. This country is founded on slavery. You know, the more the poverty rates are increasing. Like these things that law enforcement is targeting and annihilating Black bodies. Like all these things don't have to operate in silos. They actually happen in concert. So I think that's one thing that I've come back to in some conversations. Like just because one thing is true doesn't mean the other thing is not true.
I don't mean to keep quoting you to yourself, but one more comment that I thought was interesting, which you said to the supervisors, you know, you have the luxury of hearing this and not doing a damn thing. What is your expectation, or you know, what your perspective analysis on what is going to happen? You know, have you, for example, heard back from the supervisors or from the county since that hearing? Have you seen any change? Do you expect any?
I personally have only heard back from one of the 5 supervisors. And just to say, you know, I hear you and looking forward to working with you. I don't expect to hear from any of them. Again, Wendy Sims Moten was really kind of the lead. And I know that there are other members of our community who are more actively engaged with local representatives, particularly the folks of Healing Justice who were formerly identified with the Black Lives Matter movement, but have recognized that they're not an official BLM chapter, so they created a separate chapter under the name Healing Justice. And I know they're doing a lot of amazing work. So I personally don't expect to be contacted. And quite frankly, I have learned enough to really quell any expectations, generally speaking. It kind of helps me sleep better at night, and it helps me kind of get through the day, as opposed to waiting for something to happen. And just, you know, if it happens, that's great, but I don't necessarily anticipate. Again, because of the structural nature of the injustices and the inequities and inequalities, until there's some serious and significant conversations about, you know, how deeply rooted injustice and bigotry and racism and white supremacy and, you know, hatred are inculcated in the society, you know, we'll see. I mean, I hope for the best, but I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting that at the same day on the same hearing, I think before your portion of the hearing, they approved the budget, which included several new positions for the sheriff's department for custody, money for the jail.
Mm-hmm.
I guess there's twice as many folks in the DA's office as in the public defender's office. So there wasn't a lot of demonstration there. And then subsequent, they talked to the law enforcement representatives, and Sheriff Bill Brown said this. He said, "The solution to the national issue is not to gut or defund the good work of the local police. I have no doubt that change is coming, but that change needs to be reasoned with the input of others taken into account." And the point I guess he was trying to make was, just because something happened in Minneapolis does not, you know, mean that it's going to be happening in local law enforcement. What is your reaction when you hear that argument?
The 2 words, the word obtuse comes to mind. It's and deflective. You know, just because, you know, his comments, in my humble opinion, fail to acknowledge the broader reality. You can't necessarily pin this on, you know, one incident in Minneapolis. Even prior to the brutal beating of Rodney King, you know, people throughout the society, and particularly of African descent, have been saying the police have been messing with it. This is nothing new. In '92, Black communities saying this is nothing new. You just happen to catch it on tape. You know, and that was 29 years or 28 years ago. You know, now we have these advancements, so there's more recordings going on, you know, but every time I look around, there's another recording. So I just literally saw a young 19-year-old boy in Southern California pulled over by 4 or 5 police cars, all officers with their weapons drawn. He's on his hands and knees. He has his hands behind his head, and there happened to be a woman there filming it, and she's asking, "Why do you have your hands drawn? I mean, your guns drawn?" He is unarmed. He's complying, and yet and still they're yelling at him ready to pop a cap in them. So I think Sheriff Brown's comments are very insular and protective of what he considers his role is. And I don't know, I mean, I've met him a couple times. I don't know him personally, so I can't speak to his intentions, but I think it really was very tone deaf in terms of speaking to the moment and what many, many people in law enforcement know, but may not necessarily have the courage or the wherewithal to be able to come out and say that there is something systemically wrong. And it's easy for one, again, in power, to say, yeah, well, we need to be a part of the conversation, like that gentleman back in New York who gave that really painfully arrogant and ignorant press conference, about we need to be included in the conversation. And, we've been trying to include folks in the conversation for decades, literally decades, right? And so now folks are saying, okay, you're not listening, we're coming after your budgets. And we're not coming after your budget in the sense of like defunding law enforcement as though there should be none, but we need to restructure how how law enforcement is not necessarily enforcing the law, and how it is really should be more considerate of what do the people need at any given moment, right? So I think there's a lot, and even during the County Board of Supervisors hearing, a couple of weeks ago, or a week and a half ago now, there were a number of community members who came forth, and it was verified by the city council, by the Board of Supervisors themselves, in large part because of COVID, but also there's been a movement to get people out of jail who don't necessarily need to be there. Nonviolent offenders, drug offenders, light drug sentencing. So the number of inmates in North County has dropped precipitously, but yet and still we're moving forward with this funding for this new facility. So it's like you can acknowledge, yes, where there are fewer people, but we still need this facility to house people. It doesn't necessarily match up in terms of, at least in my humble opinion, and I'll own it as such, and at least in the way that I'm looking at it.
Let's talk a little bit about this whole idea of defunding the police, because I think that's something that there's a lot of freak out about. And as I understand it, there's an underlying assumption that because police officers are asked to do a lot of things which aren't necessarily quote unquote police work, whether it's things that happen with students in schools or homeless people on the street or addicted personality. There's a lot of things that perhaps there's professions better suited to be dealing with. That's sort of the starting point of that. Have I got that right? Is that correct?
In my understanding, yes. Like, does someone who is armed to the teeth in some sort of riot gear or some sort of presenting in a very kind of aggressive, forceful manner, need the correct person to respond to, like you said, someone who's drunk in public, or responding to, truancy issues, or being in the schools, or, is that the best fit? The fact that, there's such an alignment between the military and local law enforcement, not only in terms of training and tactics, but also even in terms of the very equipment that that local law enforcement use, military grade weapons. Crime is not going up. The statistics prove that, but yet and still there's this increased hyper-militarization. I think it creates this environment where people, like myself, really wonder, well, what is the priority? Again, are we, are these, and I'm not saying that this job is any, a bed of roses, right? And I get that law enforcement are called upon to do a lot of things, but that's why they need to be highly trained, highly supported, and need to be, in my humble opinion, again, given the tools of de-escalation, given the tools to be able to go into a situation, not like that 19-year-old kid down at, I think it was in Hawthorne that I just mentioned, or any number of brothers and sisters who have had absolutely no opportunity to engage the police because they were capped automatically. I can go on and on in terms
Right.
of, the examples.
You mentioned COVID a couple minutes ago, and you know, looked at one way, you know, we've sort of had a series of, you know, three crises, you know, with the pandemic and the economic collapse that followed that, and now the protests and the campaign against anti-racism and police brutality. But is there a sense in which you see them as interrelated, and that, yeah, that's my questions.
The COVID and kind of these
Yeah,
ongoing.
and the, you know, who's lost their job in the economic downturn that's followed that, and now what's happening.
Certainly, no, that's also been discussed quite readily in terms of the disproportionate impact of you know, COVID and the downturn in the economy on those communities, particularly underrepresented communities like African American, Chicanic, Latinx communities, Native communities, who already do not have a lot of the access to a lot of the support services and resources that would help these communities, our communities, be able to weather these storms. So there certainly is a correlation and a disproportionate effect in terms of COVID. And then you add in this other layer of the ongoing lifetime, decades-long response by the community in retaliation against you know, being brutalized by law enforcement. So it makes for a very intriguing time. It's interesting because during the student demonstration, was a week ago Sunday, or 2 weeks ago Sunday, there were a lot of folks who were commenting about how racism beats COVID every time, you know, like even though we should be sheltering in place and even though we need to be respecting our distances and wearing masks, which people were doing, I think, almost entirely during that student demonstration, which was expertly handled. You know, but it's even that is not enough. And this is not just here, and it's not just in California, it's not just in the United States. This is literally around the world. People are putting their lives in jeopardy to stand against this historic institutional injustice. And that the fact that so many people, and we've had historic numbers of people protesting around the country in the midst of this global pandemic, that in and of itself should say something. And of course, being very critical and skeptical of these knuckleheads and pundits who want to assign the peaceful protests to some sort of fringe movement or Antifa, or, you know, they're destroying property, and you know, there's just so much uncertainty. But that's not the point. Those things are you know, very well used tactics to distract the broader population from the point of people actually being out in the street, and also not recognizing that we ain't just talking about Minneapolis, we ain't just talking about New York, we ain't just, you know, there are people in all parts, all corners of the globe who, and it's really interesting to me, I mean, just think about that. Not only in this time of a global pandemic, but the fact that so many people around the world, in all parts of the world, are choosing to come out in this environment because of the recognition of the injustice that's happening in this country. I think that speaks tremendous encyclopedic volumes as to, one, how much the rest of the world really watches what we do here in the United States, and particularly what people of color, and I would say even particularly more so what African and African American descended people do in this country, but also how widely recognized the injustice is, such that folks in New Zealand or Paris or, you know, Iceland, there were people were demonstrating, like folks like, people have been demonstrating in Iceland, you know, they're like, yes, and they were actually coming out. So that speaks volumes, I think, to, you know, how deeply rooted and how widely observed the challenges that we have before us really and truly are.
There's obviously the mass protests are a tactic and strategy. To what extent do you see that connected, if at all, to the sort of electoral component? President Obama, former President Obama, said at a fundraiser for Joe Biden yesterday, there's a great awakening. There's a second great awakening in the land. Is this something that is going to move into electoral politics? Is it separate? What is the connection, if any?
I mean, that's a wonderful question. I'm sure that there are quite a few dissertations that are written on that very same topic. I could only offer my humble opinion, and that is that in any sort of social movement and any sort of movement for true justice and peace and equality, that one single strategy is insufficient. That if there's going to be mobilizations, there also needs to be, mobilizations in the streets. There also needs to be mobilizations to get folks out to vote. There's a reason why the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the late 60s and early 70s were so aggressively trying to get the disenfranchised Black vote in the South to register to vote. And they were literally being targeted with violence for trying to just get people registered to vote. So, and not to mention the more recent, or perhaps even ongoing acts to disenfranchise votes, the closing of countless numbers of polling stations, as what took place in Kentucky. There are consistent efforts to get people not to vote, or to discourage people from voting, just as much as a poll tax back in the day would discourage people from voting if you didn't have the ability to pay to vote. Those were legally binding and backed up by the judiciary and the politicians and law enforcement. Those are legally binding acts that were used to disenfranchise people. And again, going back to the structure, until we understand that there is a history to this that predates my lifetime, and that's for sure. Our lifetimes collectively, depending on how far you want to look at it, there needs to be some great acknowledgement. So my point is, strategically thinking, I think it's never a good idea to put all one's eggs in one basket, right? I think it's more important that there be constructive conversations and dialogue, and acknowledgement that we all will disagree, but to agree to it, and that we all have different strengths and different roles to play towards a common goal. So identifying that common goal, which I think is easier than we think it is, if we really break it down to its brass tacks, and recognizing that different people have different ways. There's a political arm, there's an economic arm, there's a more grassroots organizing arm. There's different ways of trying to do this, and I think that our history, particularly over the past 50 years or so, has many different examples of the many different ways that people have been utilizing their positions and their access to information or to institutions to be able to, if not infinite, in a small way, but perhaps in larger structural ways, to be able to address change.
And talking about putting your eggs in one basket, I think there was a sense. There was a sense, at least among white people, or a lot of white people that I know, that when Obama was elected in 2008, it was this extraordinary moment in history, and that we had therefore moved on to a quote unquote post-racialist society. A lot of the police brutality, the killings that we talked about, actually took place during Obama's administration. What do you take away from that? Was it a failure of his leadership? Was it just the persistence of racism, which perhaps even increased while he was the president? What's your analysis of that?
Yeah, I remember that moment when Obama was elected. I mean, it stands as one of the most historic moments in this nation, given everything that we were talking about, right? And I know that there was a lot of hope amongst a lot of different communities, certainly not just Black folks, because it wasn't just Black folks that voted for him. And maybe the sense of maybe we finally could heave a collective sigh of relief, like, oh, okay, whew, we got a Black president. But I think what we did is we perhaps collectively deluded ourselves into thinking that's all it would take, and not really understanding the historical context during which this is all taking place. And that may be the case. And this first African American identified gentleman was elected, president. And of course, a brilliant man. We could speak, very highly of him, but he was also challenged right out the gate, because if you recall, as soon as he was elected, members of the Republican Party said, we're not working with him at all, you know, and so that, like, right there, because like the tipping point in terms of, you know, this pendulum swing back to, you know, what we're living with now with Trump being in office. Like, well, it's okay to be a bigot, it's okay to be disrespectful, it's okay to kind of isolate ourselves with misinformation as though it is truth, and use that to perpetuate our own inherent belief system, that the Jim Crow that we were talking about earlier, to justify what we think is, you know, our inalienable God-given right for whatever that may be, you know. So out comes the alt-right. Gun ownership skyrockets, you know, amongst white men in this society. You know, politicians are saying, we're not even going to work with you. We're not even going to work with you. Even though, Congress was democratically controlled for those first 2 years. But there were so many different roadblocks being thrown into it. But again, I think we were kind of fooling ourselves because we're not understanding the structure, you know, and of course there's going to be this backlash amongst folks who, you know, for whatever, you know, whether it's part of their belief system or, you know, whatever, believe that there's no legitimacy in that gentleman being in the White House in the first place, or B, it represents this kind of liberal tide of swing that they're going to come and take our constitutional rights. Or remember, they kept saying they're coming for your guns, they're coming for your guns. That certainly didn't happen. You know, and I think there were also challenges which structurally, with the Obama administration being able to respond to. I mean, there's just so much, and personally, and I'm not going to speak poorly of Obama, but I think there are certain things that he could have done more, that he chose not to for whatever reason, and particularly in response to the Black bodies that were being annihilated. He did form a commission. That's, you know, probably the least that one could do, to look into it, and a commission on law enforcement, the modern day law enforcement. I forget the exact title of it, and those are great things. And that document is actually still referenced quite a bit, and I've gone through it, and it's impressive.
Yeah.
In terms of making suggestions about how law enforcement can evolve to the day. I think this pendulum swing back into this kind of neo-fascist, neo-Nazi conservative ideology, and blatant lying and and denial of facts, and denial of science, and denial of empirical evidence, is just representative of how deeply rooted, again, this ideology of let's just call it this ideology of white supremacy actually is ingrained in the society, and how much work there is to be done.
All right, last question, and it's sort of closing the circle on where we started with structuralism. But Representative Al Green, a longtime congressman from Houston, Texas, has put forth a bill and a proposal to create a cabinet-level racial reconciliation cabinet department, and to basically do what South Africa has done, what Germany did after the Holocaust, and kind of put it all on there. Do you think that that's ultimately what it is going to take to get at these kinds of structural problems that you've referenced?
Again, not putting all one's eggs in just one basket. I mean, I think that would have some benefit and some help, but I wouldn't hang my hat on that alone being what is needed. Again, I think it goes into this fallacy, like if we just do one thing, if we just elect one Black man, or if we pass one law, that it's going to, solve all these problems. I think that kind of movement is certainly welcome, but it has to be in concert with many other local efforts and regional efforts, like, for example, for calling for civilian review boards at law enforcement, and not civilian review boards that only operate in an advisory capacity, but that actually have some power and some teeth and some ability to be able to affect change. And that's being resisted, has been resisted since my first awareness of it, and Rodney King, and even prior to that in studying civil rights movement. That's been talked about and resisted for my entire lifetime. But those kind of things in concert, maybe there is more of a momentum building now, more of a moment where those kind of things that have been, these are not new conversations that have been talked about for so long, can actually get some momentum and build some support. But then again, going back to the structuralists, you know, we're seeing what the representatives for law enforcement are saying on a national scale. You know, you could see, and as like I saw a meme, it's like, you know, it says something like, you know, we're calling for reform, but some in law enforcement, it's almost like as though they're saying, well, we have the right to kill Black people, so you can't mess with us. I mean, it's almost like that. Like, you know, Black bodies are being killed. People are saying, stop killing Black bodies. And then law enforcement, some in law enforcement are saying, you can't tell us what to do or our job. So you're literally arguing that you still need to have the legal ability to kill Black people. So that represents a belief system and a structural deficit that we need to, or a structural reality that we need to address. So sure, I would welcome this effort, but not in isolation. These things have to happen in my humble opinion, have to happen in concert with many other efforts, both locally, regionally, in various states and throughout the country, and arguably the world.
No, and you're right on that civilian review board thing. I did a piece on civilian review boards because, you know, Black Lives Matter came into the city council and they said, we want civilian, and the city council, oh, sure. But there are so many questions, so many really fundamental questions about what does that mean? Does it have a budget? Does it have an independent investigation? Does it have
That's right.
Authority over discipline of officers and so on? That there's many a slip between a cup and a lip on that one. That's
right.
A long way to go. Hey, Aaron Jones, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, and we'd love to have you back as we continue, and go Niners. I know.
That's right. I was waiting for you to get that one in there, Jerry.
All right. Thanks, Aaron.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Hey, that was good. Yeah.
Yeah. You're still recording, looks like.